News, weather, and talk on KCAA 102.3 FM, broadcasting to the Moreno Valley, Corona, and Riverside.
Welcome to Smart Health Talk with your host, Elaine McFadden.
Take a walk on the wild side. Will the birds and the bees survive? Right before me, my newfound hippie side. Once ignored these conspiracies online. Out the window, visions of the earth. Sign me up now, make sure you use your smart. Take a walk on the wild side. Will the birds and the bees survive? Would your children lie to see Mother Nature sigh?
Welcome to Smart Health Talk with your host, Elaine McFadden.
Welcome, everyone. This is Smart Health Talk Radio Show. I'm your host, Elaine McFadden. And are you tuned in to the right place or what? Because we got a show for you today that we are extremely excited about. And I tell you, I have been out there talking to people out in the community, and I'm like, hey, you heard about that, the big Monsanto trial, didn't you? And people are like, no. And I mean, I'm talking to like landscapers and, other health professionals, these kind of people. And I'm thinking these people got to be in with what's going on with the trial of the century. Haven't even heard what's going on. What does that tell you, everybody? What does that tell you if you have not even heard that there was a $289 settlement? I think that's the right number. For Dwayne Johnson, and this is not the actor, everyone, even though the name sounds the same. It's Dwayne, it's not Dwayne. And this is a humble man. He was just a janitor. He was instructed to spray Roundup around school campuses. In case you didn't notice, that was a red flag right there. Roundup, cancer-causing. This janitor was spraying it around school campuses where your children are going to school. Okay, so this is everyday practice, FYI. We have all the info on our Blue Monarch Project website under local pesticide use. It's right there on the homepage. Check out what's going on at your local school here and what goes on in our whole county. And those of you that don't live here, just check it out, because it's probably reflective of what's going on there, because we have all the info. We went and used the Freedom of Information Act. We got the info on what pesticides are being used, and it's shocking. Look up your street and find out your kid's school and what's being used right across the street. Shocking. And I guarantee Roundup is on the list of every single school district that I've encountered so far as the go-to that they're going to be used to spray all around the campus. Well, we've already had a go-to moment here in Southern California where we brought an organic landscape expert over to a school. He took lawn that was ugly, patchy, watered 6 times a week even, and it still wasn't green. He turned that without one pesticide, without one chemical, all organic, same cost, a year ahead of time, green carpet, watered it 2 times a week, working to 1 time per week. So if in your mind there's a thought that we have to do this because it's necessary, I wanted to wipe that away. I want to start off with a clean slate here, because we have a guest that was at that trial. That trial I'm talking about with Dwayne Johnson versus Monsanto, mega international giant, okay? Here we had humble little Dwayne Johnson, janitor, told to spray Roundup 30 times a year, had an accident. The hose broke, covered his entire body. And when you see the pictures, it is so upsetting. I mean, literally huge growths coming from his skin. His body was completely whacked out. He now has terminal cancer. He was the first case of this kind to go before the California court, and a lot of things had to happen before that. I'm not going to go into because we've talked about it before. But there were some key people at this trial that testified to get that verdict. And we have one of those key people with us today, Dr. Chuck Benbrook. And this is one of our star scientists here. I don't think that there's very many people out there that don't have respect for Dr. Chuck Benbrook. And that's because this man, it's how he's conducted himself, I think, through his entire life. I mean, he's got strong ethics, strong work ethic, stands up for what he thinks is right. He's willing to fight for it, no matter what kind of backlash he gets from big corporate or anybody else. And I consider that, he's definitely on my hero list, and I consider him a very bright person, although I can bet you that he probably wouldn't describe himself like that, but he is to me. And he testified with all that knowledge that he had accumulated over the decades before that at a critical time, a very, very critical time, because we are looking at global warming that can be connected to pesticide use. And so when we're talking about increasing pesticide use versus decreasing pesticide use, this could be a game changer, okay? And it could decide our future of our planet even. So that's how serious I take this. And when I find people on the street that have not heard about this, it tells me there's a reason they're not hearing about it, because mainstream media isn't talking about it. Well, guess what? We've talked about it through the entire trial. Way before that, for like 9 years, we've been warning people that Roundup is probably not good. It probably is cancer causing, even though we didn't have the solid proof that we needed. So now we have this trial with all of these key scientists testifying, including Dr. Benbrook. Well, I don't know about you, but I want to know all about it, okay? I want to know what it was like there in the courtroom. I want to know what you said, because obviously it was pretty important to the jury, and it must be important to us too, and maybe there's something key here that can make a difference in your life, your family's life, someone you care about. So please stay tuned for this entire hour. Hear Dr. Benbrook out. Listen to one of our top scientists in the country that is not paid off. He is there for us. So for once, we have someone like that on the show, okay? So please stick with me the entire time. And I tell you, I am just going to hand this over to Dr. Benbrook. I'm going to let you I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself. And then we're just going to get into what it's like at that trial. And he's going to give us some information on what he talked about and what he knows about glyphosate and why they decided glyphosate causes cancer, and it caused Dwayne Johnson's cancer, and that's why he got the multi-million-dollar settlement that he got, because they felt that Monsanto was malice. They lied, they deceived. Yeah. I know you think these people are all honest, telling you the truth all the time. I'm sorry to tell you this is not the case, okay? Okay, let me get right to our guest. Here's Chuck Benbrook, everybody. Benbrook. Chuck Benbrook is last time.
Hello, Elaine. Can you hear me?
I had a dental implants the last time he came on, and I kept mispronouncing his name. But I got it right this time. And I just want to welcome you so much to the show. Do you prefer for us to call you Dr. Benbrook or Chuck?
Chuck would be just fine.
Okay, Chuck. All right. So, how did it go down? I mean, did you just get a phone call, or were you part of this process all along for the trial?
Well, Lee Johnson Dwayne Johnson is generally known as Lee to his friends and in most of the court documents. He started the litigation.
Okay, okay, there, a little bit. Okay, we missed the first part of that, Chuck. Let's see if we're gonna. Okay, you're breaking up a little bit, so we're gonna have to fix that.
Okay.
Okay, our engineer's on us. Go ahead and start over.
In October of 2017.
Okay.
By Miller Group, which is the law firm representing Lee Johnson. And they invited me to start reviewing this massive discovery record in the case. One of the things that this litigation has done is it's provided access for the people involved in the case to some 7 million documents that have been provided by Monsanto to the attorneys. And this formed a major part of the record that I was asked to review and draw upon informing my opinions in the case.
Why you, Chuck?
Filed an expert report in December of 2017. Then early in this year, in 2018, I was deposed by the attorneys for Monsanto in the case, and finally the trial actually started in San Francisco. It began in July. My day on the stand was the 27th of July. That was actually the last day that the plaintiffs were presenting the plaintiffs' attorneys were presenting their case. And so I was sort of the last person in the box, as it were, and it was a very intense scene for sure. Everyone in the
I can't even
courtroom,
imagine
everyone that's
having
been
those
involved with
lawyers.
this case understood the stakes.
What's it like having Monsanto lawyers coming at you when you were being deposed and then in the courtroom? Did they really come after the jugular?
Not as much as I had expected in this case. I've done, believe it or not, Elaine, 30 hours of on-camera depositions as part of this litigation.
Wow.
That's a lot of hours in front of a camera. The job of the Monsanto attorneys is to probe the basis of my opinions that I stated in my expert report and for which I'm prepared to testify at trial. And they did a thorough and aggressive job of trying to determine whether I had a solid scientific foundation for everything that I said, and
they have to discredit you, so they have to plan their strategy.
It was all very professional, and then the day of reckoning came when it was my turn to testify at the trial.
So why did they choose you, Chuck, to begin with? What's in your history that made you a right person for the job?
Well, believe it or not, Elaine, and we've talked about some of this history before on your show, you will recall that in the early part of my career, I was the staff director of a congressional subcommittee on the House side that happened to have jurisdiction over pesticides, the federal pesticide law. My boss at the time was one of the truly great congressmen from the Inland Empire, George Brown.
Okay.
Who at the time was the chairman of this subcommittee. Well, even back in 1982, some of the most important issues involving regulation of pesticides involved how to deal with those pesticides known to pose a risk of cancer. So I've been dealing with this mix of scientific issues and challenges and legal and regulatory issues and challenges really throughout my entire career. The Miller Group attorneys sought me out because I've published a number of peer-reviewed papers on glyphosate and Roundup use, as well as some of the new evidence raising new concerns about the public health risks and human health risks from exposure to Roundup. They knew I brought to the case really 20 years of tracking the history of glyphosate and Roundup as it moved through the various EPA decision and review processes, and went through into the era of genetically engineered crops starting in 1996. When, as you've covered on this show many times, Elaine, when the use of Roundup really took off and started to rise really at a pace no other pesticide in history has grown at. So the lawyers in Lee Johnston's case wanted to draw on my sort of historical memory and long involvement in the case and my grasp of the sciences that come into play in evaluating the risk associated with the use of and exposures to Roundup.
Okay, well, do you mind giving us like a few highlights from some of the research that you've done? What in the research that you communicated during the trial that you thought was kind of a good kind of a good thing to have in your toolbox there for the plaintiff, Dwayne?
I think the part of my direct testimony that had the biggest impact on the jury was I had an opportunity to put a large chart on an easel, right in front of the jury box that had data on the increased pounds of glyphosate used in American agriculture from 1987 through to 2017. And by walking the jury through the steady increases in Roundup use in the 1980s and into the say the mid 1990s, and then starting in 1996 with the approval of the Roundup Ready soybeans and Roundup Ready cotton, that's when the use of Roundup started to exponentially rise in the United States. And I walked the jury through the movement of glyphosate up the list of the most heavily applied 25 pesticides in U.S. agriculture. This is a periodic listing that the EPA puts out in one of their standard informational reports. And I had basically moved this ranking of the top 25 pesticides from in 1987 on through to 2012, the last year that the EPA put out this ranking. And by the year 2000 or 2001, glyphosate or Roundup reached the #1 spot. And in other words, in 2001, there was more glyphosate applied in the United States by farmers than any other pesticide. But since that date, in 2001, the use of Roundup tripled. So it already, by 2001, was the most heavily applied pesticide in the country. But since that time, the total volume applied over a 16-year period tripled, to the point where now in the United States, about there's enough glyphosate applied each year to spray about 3/4 pound on every cropland acre in the country. It's it's hard to imagine that any pesticide could come to be used that widely, but that's the case with Roundup today.
So, Chuck, we are hearing in the news, just in the past week or so, testing has been done on children's cereals, oat products, and they're finding residues of glyphosate in there. When you hear about these residues that are showing up in our food, tell us what comes into your mind when you hear that, because I'm sure that there's something that you can put together in your mind where you probably predicted that something like this could happen based on the trends you were seeing before that. Is the video okay? Okay. Explain to us, for people that are hearing these residues of glyphosate on their children's cereal, what should we all be thinking? Like, how did this happen, and then what should we be thinking about it right now?
Well, in every generation, going back to when I started in this business in the mid-'70s, maybe every 10 years or so, there'll be a change in the pesticides that are commonly present in foods that we all eat. The pesticides that we were exposed to in the 1980s are most of them aren't around anymore, and there's new chemistry and new products that have been used.
There was a reason for some of those. There was a reason, because they were really toxic.
Without a doubt, the one of the most significant new dietary sources of exposure to pesticides has become glyphosate from Roundup herbicide. The reasons that so many of the oat-based products that were tested by the Environmental Working Group, the reason that they all contained quantifiable levels of glyphosate is that some farmers are spraying Roundup late in the crop cycle of growing, in this case, oats. So they'll spray the oat fields a couple of weeks before the normal time that the fields would be ready for harvest, and the combine would move out into the field and harvest the grain. But Monsanto has gained registrations and to allow these so-called pre-harvest desiccation uses of Roundup. So basically, they're spraying Roundup on a mature, ready-to-harvest oat crop or a mature, ready-to-harvest wheat crop, and right at the time that the grain goes into the bin of the combine, and then it goes into the truck and on into the supply chain to the mill, and ultimately into whatever food product or food ingredients are made from those grains. Unfortunately, there's enough of the wheat crop, the oat crop, and the barley crop in the United States that is treated with glyphosate in this way that it ends up kind of getting mixed into the grain supply and then shows up as these relatively low level residues, but in almost all oat-based products. It's really quite remarkable. If somebody had told me 15 years ago that 95% of Americans on a daily basis would have detectable levels of glyphosate in their urine from dietary exposure, I'd say, are you kidding? How could that happen? Well, it's happened.
Okay, I would like to go back, as you told us how we've increased the use of Roundup. So this is like kind of in my mind how like some of these residues are showing up as well, because as we started to increase the use, the accumulation of Roundup in the soil also increased. And so the lower residue levels that we started out with, or that were allowed to be used, the concentration levels, those also kept increasing because Monsanto was going back to the government and saying, can we have a higher level and still get away with it? Because we can't grow any other way because of it's accumulated in the soil that we can't even achieve those lower numbers anymore. I mean, do I have that right? Is that the way it went down?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's with all things in the world of pesticide risk assessment and pesticide regulation. It's all very complicated, but the one driving reality in the case of glyphosate and Roundup is that there's just so much used in so many different ways that it's inevitable that people are going to end up being exposed to glyphosate and formulated glyphosate herbicides in a variety of ways that we weren't exposed 20 years ago. And in the case of Lee Johnson, the groundskeeper for the Benicia School District, he was an example of a person who, as part of his job, had to put on a backpack sprayer or carry around a handheld sprayer with a wand and apply Roundup in and around the school buildings on poison ivy that could infect the children. And it was something that he did as part of his job. And unfortunately, he had experienced a couple of very high exposure episodes that, things happen when you're applying a herbicide through this sort of handheld or backpack sprayer equipment, and that's that's what led to Lee Johnson's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and this litigation. But the fact that most of us have glyphosate in us on a daily basis. Probably most of it's from our diet. For some people, the part of it may be coming from their drinking water. And then, if for anyone that's actually applying Roundup as part of their work or to keep weeds down around their home, there's certainly the chance that there's some exposures from those applications. But it's just kind of hard to avoid now because so much of it is now used on an annual basis. And in some environments, the levels are incrementally going up, including in some soils. So your basic fear that we're kind of on a slippery slope now, and we sure have to hope that glyphosate isn't that toxic, because we're all being exposed to it on a regular basis.
So the other research that you guys talked about in court, was that your personal research that you quoted during the testimony? Well,
so most of the trial, most of the evidence that was presented to the jury was focused on the basic scientific question. Is there credible science that suggests that Lee Johnson's exposures to Roundup through his job, did those exposures contribute to his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? It was not necessary for the plaintiff's attorneys to prove that Lee Johnson's use and exposure to Roundup was the sole cause of his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but what the judge asked the jury to decide was whether, in their judgment, based on all the scientific evidence that they heard, did Lee Johnson's use of and exposure to Roundup contribute to his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? And by a unanimous vote, the jury said yes.
Oh, it was unanimous. And is my math right? But it seems like pretty much there has been quite a few trials that led up to that, including the other one that was kind of running parallel or had to finish before the Dwayne Johnson, from what I understand. The other one that went on from like March till June or July. And I really want to commend that judge for taking the effort that he did to call witnesses back and make sure that he completely understand the science, because that was a lot for him to take in as one judge. And he knew that a lot was on his shoulders.
I'll tell you, Elaine, the history of this case and the way that both the federal court in San Francisco and the state court dealt with the incredibly complicated record and science in this case was really very impressive. I have to tip my hat to the jury who showed up every day, paid close attention, sort of tried to sort out the conflicting views stated by the scientists. But, at the end of the day, the jury did just what the Monsanto attorney in his opening statement asked it to do. He said to them, you're going to hear a lot of science, a lot of information in this case, and I hope you listen to the science carefully and let it guide you in your ultimate decision in the case. And the good news is that's exactly what they did. They listened to the science. They sort of sorted out what they could really trust versus what they couldn't put much faith in. And at the end of the day, the evidence in support of Lee Johnson in his incredible battle against this very big company, the science won out at the end of the day. And it's a real tribute to the court system that it provided a venue where all of Monsanto's access to scientists and their ability to spin science, it just didn't cut it in that courtroom in San Francisco.
Didn't they suppress a lot of evidence as part of the defendant's strategy?
Yes, throughout the month-long trial, the Monsanto attorneys were constantly objecting to the placing into evidence of mostly internal Monsanto emails that the judge considered to be so highly charged or prejudicial against Monsanto that the judge would not allow the jury to see the documents. And this this led to great frustration for Lee Johnson's attorneys because they sort of felt like they had one hand tied behind their back.
So if they would have actually been able to see that other suppressed information, what kind of stuff was in there? I mean, were they like really talking some bad conspiracy type things, lying to the public, that kind of thing?
Well, there were really three or four things that the judge was extremely insistent to the attorneys on both sides that you just can't let any of your witnesses talk about. One was the Proposition 65 lawsuit involving the listing of glyphosate on Prop 65. As you know, that appeal was going on right at the same time as the Lee Johnson trial in San Francisco. The judge said, no one can talk about that. You cannot breathe the words Prop 65. So, everyone followed that. The judge also said that no one can talk about GMOs or the impact of genetically engineered crops on glyphosate use. That was, the judge deemed that a not relevant topic to present to the jury, so there was no discussion. So during my direct testimony, when I was walking the jury through the increase in Roundup use starting in 1996, I couldn't use the words because Roundup was used on genetically engineered crops. I couldn't say that, but I just said corn and soybean and cotton farmers used a lot more Roundup. Okay. That's what I was allowed to say. The judge also prohibited any of the expert witnesses for Lee Johnson. We were unable to discuss many internal Monsanto emails where they were discussing amongst themselves how to deal with new science, including sometimes studies that Monsanto itself had commissioned. New science that suggested that the risk associated with exposure to Roundup was actually higher than what Monsanto had known from its past work, and what higher than what the EPA thought to be the case based on their current risk assessments. So the jury heard just a little bit about the degree to which Monsanto over the years was, let's just say, less than forthcoming with the EPA regarding what it knew about the toxicity and risks associated with Roundup. So that was another area.
So was Monsanto suppressing evidence to the public? So it was pretty much, was it kind of exposing Monsanto for suppressing evidence that was being told to the public, so we weren't getting the whole story? Do you feel like that was it?
Well, I was only there for actually the day that I testified. The judge ordered that all of the testifying experts in the case could not attend any of the trial until they testified in order to prevent the testimony of one expert influencing that of another.
Yeah.
So, I have not had a chance to read the entire transcript of the trial and hear what all of the other experts were able to tell the jury. But I do think it's a fair reading of the verdict, the unanimous verdict from the jury, that they felt that Monsanto had not been forthcoming and had not acted the way that a responsible company would to assure that it did everything possible to prevent the kind of exposures and the kind of risks that ended up, cutting that's going to cut Lee Johnson's life short. I mean, this is just this is
one
very
case.
Kind, humble man doing his job, and he's this disease is going to shorten his life, and it's just a real shame because it
you
just
can tell he's a nice
guy.
guy.
Didn't have to go down the way that it did.
So did they have any? Did the jury come back when they were in deliberating? Did they ever have any other questions, or did they just go in there and they just handle it all by themselves and made the decision with everything that they had? Was there ever any confusion?
The jury deliberated for 3 days. They started on Wednesday, and they reached their verdict about 2:00 in the afternoon on Friday. One of the local San Francisco TV stations, news stations, was allowed to actually film the reading of the verdict, and that 30 minutes of footage is really very dramatic. And I hope you'll put a link to it on your website.
Absolutely.
And on my website, Hygiea Analytics, there's multiple ways to get to that actual reading of the verdict by the judge. It's very, very, it was a very emotional experience for everyone in that courtroom.
Wow. I can imagine. To me, this trial could just be lead to all different kinds of changes. it's just kind of like something that was the catalyst that just then took all these other things, just gave them what they needed to take off. And you see it already with stock prices dropping. The people are really starting to talk now. Maybe we should be taking this off the shelf in Europe. Home improvement stores are talking about taking it off the shelf. When you hear those kind of things, I mean, what do you think? Do you think this is going in the right direction?
Well, many of your listeners may not know that Bayer, the makers of Bayer aspirin, the large drug, pesticide, chemical company, German company, has bought Monsanto. They bought Monsanto for $66 billion. The acquisition of Monsanto was announced about 4 or 5 months ago. It had a variety of legal hurdles that it had to go through to get approval by all the different parts of the U.S. government that has to approve this sort of major acquisition.
I think it's an antitrust violation
company.
myself. I think it's antitrust violation because we in the world, which that's how we work now globally. We have a handful of companies. We have just a couple of companies now that are pretty much controlling everything. They're controlling the seed supply. They're controlling the pesticide supply, chemicals. I mean, how many companies do we have now? Like 3 or 4 that are controlling?
There's 5 major international players, but think about what the Bayer corporate management and their board of directors must be facing now. They just spent $66 billion to buy Monsanto, knowing that this litigation was over non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was moving along in the courts, knowing that there are significant problems associated with dicamba herbicide and the new XtendiMax technology that Monsanto brought onto the scene a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I had a question for that.
The first 4,000 cases, Bayer is looking at having to write a $289 million check. Talk about a buzzkill.
And that's case number 1 when we have about 400 pending in California and 5,000 nationwide. So that was the first case when we have all of these coming behind them still, because lots of people got cancer, everybody. Lots of people, okay? So that's why, they're doing that. But I wanted to ask you, I'm glad that you brought that. What was the name of that last product? It was a Max product, the technology. Because when you see these Roundup products and it says 365 days on it, and I'm just like, what kind of poison continues to poison for an entire year? It's crazy. And I remember you saying, Chuck, remember you saying a really important quote, and I actually made a graphic of it, and it had to do with the dose, but also the concentration of the pesticide. I think it was something to do with those 2 things that have a big determining factor of the overall toxicity of the product. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. And, one of the things that, just the general public can easily become confused about, in some context, we talk about the toxicity and properties of Roundup as a herbicide, as an agent that kills weeds. Roundup is toxic to weeds, and we speak about the properties of Roundup as a herbicide. But then we also, it's also important to think about and understand the impact of exposure to glyphosate and glyphosate-based herbicides like Roundup on public health. And this is where it becomes important to track exposure levels and the duration of exposures, and trying to sort out the impact of one pesticide. In this case, we're talking about Roundup on public health, taking into account exposures that we all have to other pesticides, other chemicals, maybe medications that we're on, it's very complicated to isolate out the unique impact of any one chemical on either a single individual's health problems, in this case, in the case of Lee Johnson, his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or to come to grips with what kind of overall impact our everyday exposures to glyphosate through wheat and oat-based products are having on the development of our kids' brains and nervous systems, and the functioning of our immune systems, and our gut biome, and a variety
our
of
reproductive ability,
complex ways that pesticides can impact public health. We are long on questions and short on answers.
What do you know? What do you know, Chuck, from your research that you want to tell us right now? Because we got 5 minutes left, and I want to fit, some of the most important messages that we want to leave in people's brains as we end this show. And I really want to thank everyone that stayed with us this entire time, and I hope you've enjoyed talking to Dr. Benbrook as much as I have, Chuck. Because I've been sitting here just sucking it up because I'm learning so much from this interview. I know that you did other important research on glyphosate. Is there any last things that you'd want to tell us from that research, and please, say I had no clue that you had this website. Can you say the website name again? I want to know that, and any last thoughts that you want to give us.
In fact, just today, we posted a blog on my website, Hygeia Analytics, about my testimony at the Johnson trial. I think you'll find it quite interesting. And Elaine, you could put the URL to this blog on your website later. I'll email it to you. But the one message that cutting through all the complexities, we know a few things for sure. The Roundup has come to be the most widely used pesticide in history. It's in our bodies and impacting organisms up and down the tree of life. It's part of our world, our environment, and we know that exposure levels are going up in general. And they will probably continue to rise in step with increasing use. If we keep spraying more glyphosate, there'll be more glyphosate in the soil, in food, in water, and in our bodies. And I think taking some prudent steps now to bend that curve back towards lowering levels just makes a lot of sense while we sort the rest of the science out.
How do we help farmers do that? Do we educate them on transitioning to teach them new types of farming methods, sustainable agriculture, as opposed to help them make more money?
Large-scale corn, soybean, cotton farmers that have been planting genetically engineered seeds and relying on Roundup for the last 20 years, they are in a very tough bind. They're dealing with a number of glyphosate-resistant weeds in their fields right now that are very costly and difficult to control. They're having to pay extra money now for seeds that are genetically engineered to tolerate either dicamba or 2,4-D, the two other herbicides that are now becoming much more widely used, especially in the Midwest. And these are old school herbicides that we've known for 40 years cause birth defects, reproductive problems, and cancer. And yet, this is the old chemistry that we're going back to give these farmers a way to deal with the glyphosate-resistant weeds. It's kind of it's a losing proposition. It's pouring gasoline on a fire to put it out.
Well, we need to put some money towards helping these farmers and not just throwing tariffs out there. Okay, well, Thank you so much, Dr. Benbrook. And I did. This was just an incredible interview, and I just want to thank you for your service, being there, representing all of us at that trial, and giving your whole heart into it. And I know your heart was in there when you talked to those people, because you believe in what you were saying, and that I'm sure that got through to the jury. And you were they chose you the last person for a reason. You left the lasting impression, and that's the most important, actually. So I'm just so grateful for you. I really am. You're just one of my very favorite people, and I just so appreciate you. And I appreciate you joining us here today. And thank you, all you listeners out there, and find us on iHeartRadio. That's where our podcasts go, everybody. And tune in next Tuesday, 4 o'clock. I'm Elaine McFadden, thanking you. And please buy organic, okay? All right, bye.
You use your smile. Take a walk on the wild side.
KCAA Loma Linda, 1050 AM, 106.5 FM, and now 102.3 FM.